I've always been interested in building a car. From a young age, from about 16, I always thought of buying a Volkswagen Beetle and ripping the top off and using the chassis and building a car on it. I've always sort of been interested in a car that handles better than normal or better than what I had, and over the years I did a bit of club racing and sort of got more interested in it and decided at one stage that I have to do it and started looking at kit cars, and couldn't really find anything satisfactory here. It seemed like in the UK they had lots of great stuff, and America has lots of great stuff, and we have a bit of a limited market here. That led me to think about building my own. So I bought a $20 CAD program from Harvey Norman and installed it on the computer and started drawing, and I made some sketches of where I need to sit in it and things like that, and thought about it for a time and then decided that I think I have to do this. I've always liked building things, so I just thought I'll get into it, I'll make a start. I had a look at a lot of kits that were available and what they had to offer, and then I sort of looked at what I was capable of doing, and one of my prerequisites was that I'd want to do it just about all myself. So it was stuff that I could do in my shed with the tools I had at the time. So the design was around what I could do and what compromises I might have to make along the way as well, because I've not realised that I can or can't do a process. So that's what led the design along. I'd look at other designs or things that I wanted, things that were important, weren't important, and then incorporate them as I went along. The first step I took in building the car was probably getting my... I had an overall design, so I wanted it to be a mid or rear engine car, all independent suspension, and so I, first of all, being quite tall, I had to fit myself in the vehicle. So I bought a cheap pair of seats and most of the stuff I bought fairly cheap because I wasn't sure whether I was actually going to build this thing right through. So I thought I'll do a prototype and then I'll build a good one. So this is the prototype, and so I got these seats and I sat in them and I took some sideways shots of myself in the seats with dimensions, and then incorporated that into my CAD designs of a rear engine. I'd seen the Suzuki engine in another vehicle and thought it worked really well because of the way it brought the weight forward in the vehicle. So I just had to marry myself with the engine position and work everything else around it. Lots of decisions had to be made on parts, and probably the next decision after the engine was the front suspension, because that was the geometry and all that had to be worked out. So I looked around at wrecking yards for various components which I could use and what was commonly available. So I found that the Holden Gemini front ends were conducive for modification, much as they use Cortinas in the UK. There was a lot of them available, and so I was able to get those parts quite easily and start designing. So then the next step was to work out all the geometry, because I wasn't going to use the A-arms from that vehicle because they were large, heavy and weren't the right track width for me. So I had to design the suspension arms, and then things worked around that. Most of the other stuff worked around that. The instrumentation was from the vehicle. That was quite easy. I was quite happy with the dash layout, and having to use most of the loom was good, because modifying that could change the emissions standards and things like that. So that's the main decisions, was myself, the engine and the front suspension. All in all, it took me around about somewhere between 1,000 hours and 1,500 hours. I didn't really keep a track of that or the cost of parts too much. I just sort of went ahead as I got to each stage. Once the vehicle was built, I had to get it through a number of compliance regulatory type tests. It had to go through an emissions test, braking test, a torsion test for the chassis and a beaming test for the chassis for the strength, and then it just has to meet all the Australian design rules with things like mirrors and seat belts and seats and steering wheels and all those things that have ADRs on it, lights, tail lights, all those sorts of things. Now that the project's finished, I love driving it. I was convinced along the way to make certain decisions, and that's led me to having an open-top car, and it's very light. And although the engine's quite small, the performance is really good, and you know, and probably will get better as I develop it. But I love the handling of it. It's so light. The front end is very, very light. It can rotate on its rear quite quickly, so turning into corners is very, very responsive, to the point that you can throw it in as quick as you like almost. You know, it's just so much fun. It's like a little go-kart, or a big go-kart. I just love it.